Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Jen Van Steenbergen. I am the Executive Coordinator for the Alberta Restorative Justice Association. And I'm so excited that you could join us today for the Serving Victims Through Restorative Justice webinar. You'll shortly see the faces of our two presenters today, Erin Lyons and Alan Edwards. ARJA is very passionate about ensuring that the victim is heard, protected, and respected throughout the process of restorative justice. So in 2017, ARJA received a grant from Victims Fund to pursue an in-depth study on how to serve victims through restorative justice. ARJA created a consultation committee and hired Just Outcomes Canada to do the research and produce what is now the Serving Victims Through Restorative Justice Guide. Our two presenters today, Erin Lyons, who is from Just Outcomes Canada, and Alan Edwards, who is from Restorative Opportunities Program of Correctional Services Canada, both worked on the guide that has been created and is now available for free on our ARJA website if you have not already downloaded it. So a few notes about our two presenters. Erin Lyons is an experienced and passionate restorative justice specialist with over 15 years international experience in supporting individual organizations and communities in trauma-informed approaches to justice. Erin is a co-founder of Just Outcomes Canada, and between 2009 and 2018, he facilitated victim offender dialogues in crimes of severe violence within Correctional Service Canada's Restorative Opportunities program. Highlights of Erin's work include facilitating family group conferences in the United States, Canada, and New Zealand, delivering seminars and workshops in Bermuda, Brazil, Hong Kong, and the Canadian Arctic, leading arts-based dialogue programs among Israeli, Palestinian, and Canadian students, and supporting adjudicated young men through conflict and addiction recovery. He currently lives in Fort Langley, British Columbia, with his wife and two young boys. Our other presenter, Alan Edwards, has been a facilitator in the field of restorative justice for over 20 years. He has worked closely with victims and offenders in hundreds of cases, and most of them involving violence. Since 2004, he has been working exclusively on cases of serious and violent crimes in the Restorative Opportunities Program of Correctional Service Canada. Alan has co-authored 5 papers on restorative justice and violence and has delivered workshops and advanced restorative justice training throughout Canada and the United States. He is also an instructor with the Crisis and Trauma Resource Institute, Achieve Training Center, and serves as a guest trainer for CJI, which is the Initiatives of Fraser Community Justice Valley in British Columbia. So Erin and Alan, if you can join me via webcam, that would be awesome. Erin and Alan will leave some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So as we go, if you have questions, please submit them under the questions bar in the GoToWebinar panel. Try not to use the chat, as we're going to try to filter through questions utilizing that feature. And when the webinar is done, you will be prompted to complete a survey. And we take these surveys very seriously. We love to get feedback as to how we did, what you liked, what you didn't like for our future webinars and our future presentations. So with that being said, I am extremely excited to present Alan Edwards and Erin Lyons. Take it away.
Great. Thanks for Jen. Alan Edwards here in Edmonton, Alberta, alongside my friend and colleague Erin Lyons, who is in Halifax, Nova Scotia, some 3,700 kilometers away from me. Before we get going, I want to respectfully acknowledge that this part of the Edmonton area is located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place of diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence this city and this entire area. It was important for me to get involved in this Serving Crime Victims Through ARJA project because as I travel around Canada and occasionally the United States delivering training to restorative justice practitioners, I hear many people struggling with how to work well with crime victims and unsure how best to involve them in our justice processes. And at the same time, I hear from many victims that they did not find their experience in their RJ process to meet their needs as fully as they needed or expected. So I'm passionate about wanting us to do everything we can do in RJ to engage respectfully, passionately, and knowledgeably and fully with victims in our work. And that's why I'm here. Aaron?
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. I particularly want to thank ARJA for having spearheaded this, the Alberta Restorative Justice Association. I really want to welcome everybody who's here on the webinar, particularly crime victims and survivors who have chosen to join us today, and those in the victim support and advocacy field. Your attendance and voice in all this means a lot. I am, as Alan said, presenting from the East Coast today, which is not my home, but I'm privileged today to be a guest on traditional and ancestral Mi'kmaq territory. And I'd also like to thank you, Alan, for your partnership in this project, as well as our whole team. Jennifer Hazlitt, also based in Alberta, Matthew Hartman, based in Portland, Oregon, Catherine Bargan, who works out of Vancouver, BC, and Jennifer Cracknell, who is a student researcher on the project, who's based in Mission, BC. Just a note about the demographics of our research team and the writing team. We're all of us from a restorative justice background as opposed to a victim services or victim assistance background. There's a mixture of male and female influences on our team. We're all Caucasian. All of these factors influence the way that we see the world, which of course also affects what we don't see and what we fail to think about. And so just wanted to give you that caveat about ourselves. For me personally, you know, this is an issue that I feel a lot of passion about. As Alan alluded to, you know, we see highs and lows when it comes to victims' experience of restorative justice. And you know, I think that how we as a society and we as communities approach the question of victimization and people who have been hurt by injustice says a lot about our values. And so there's a real opportunity here to examine our values when it comes to these questions. At its finest, I have heard, and many of you on the line may have heard, stories of restorative justice being a very welcome place for crime victims and survivors to find some much needed acknowledgement, choice, agency, unconditional support. And as was said, you know, we as a field are sometimes dangerously close to reproducing some of the very non-trauma informed, maybe more offender-oriented ways of looking at justice that is ingrained in the traditional justice system. And that's not to say that our justice system is necessarily serving offenders well as it stands. Certainly, victims have said that it is a place of great pain for many. So we have an opportunity perhaps to begin or to continue shaping restorative justice as a service that can address some of those shortcomings. I'm going to move us along, and I want to highlight for you, as Jen mentioned, that the presentation today is based on a written resource which is available for free online, and it's unfortunately the link that's provided on your screen is not functioning as a hyperlink. So if you wouldn't mind distributing the link for where that guide can be accessed, if you haven't done so already, that would be great. The guide is organized into 3 basic sections. One is about setting the context and looking at you know, the lay of the land in terms of restorative justice and victims, why this topic. Number 2 gets into a literature review. and looking at restorative justice in the literature pertaining to victims' needs and issues. And then the third part of the guide has to do with what does this mean for practice, both as program administrators, also for practitioners. And so that's really the structure that we're going to be following today as well when it comes to introducing you to this topic. We're going to pull out some of what we think are some of the highlights of the guide in the hopes that it gives you some food for thought from whatever background you're coming from and from whatever country. I understand we have some folks from other parts of the world today, and thank you for joining us. And so hopefully it can provide some food for thought as well as get you interested in reading through the guide that's been produced. I don't know, anything you want to add at this stage, Alan, before we plunge ahead?
No, I think we're good to go. Yeah, let's dive in.
Good. Okay, so in terms of setting the context, we'll go over a few topics here, and the first is why this topic? Why is it important? And you know, Alan and I have already alluded to some of our personal experiences. There has been, you know, the question right since the beginning of restorative justice as a field in the modern criminal context, the question of how are victims being responded to well in this work? And so this is not a brand new question, but it is one that requires our ongoing attention. The restorative justice advocate, the late restorative justice advocate, Dennis Maloney, based out of Deschutes County in Oregon, used to tell a story, an anecdote to many audiences as he was trying to raise awareness about restorative justice, painting a picture. Imagine this scene that you look out your window and you come out to the street and you come across a woman lying on the curb, and she's surrounded by 3 small children huddled over her, and all of them are crying. Now, off in the shadows, you see somebody slipping away. So he would ask, based on your intuition as a responsible neighbor and responsible citizen, who is the first person you attend to in this scenario? And regardless of what kind of audience he was speaking to, you know, most of us, and probably most of us on this line, would say that we would first go to the person lying on the street and see if they're okay. And maybe if we understood that they were okay, we would go second to the children and make sure that their needs were attended to. That's a kind of a common sense response to that type of scenario. And yet it has not been the predominant response of the justice system. And so, you know, that's where restorative justice has promoted itself to make a difference. Restorative justice has, in the literature, promoted itself as a victim-centered response to crime and to harm. Or at least a useful place for victims to find a sense of justice. And yet, when we scan the literature, as Alan will help us do today, we find that many programs and practices don't align with those goals, and that, in fact, they begin and sometimes end with the needs of people who commit crimes as the primary focus. So in many ways, this guide attempts to address that gap. In terms of the focus of the guide and some of the language we'll be using, I want to highlight just a couple of points. First is that you know, many victims of acute harm and trauma, like a crime, have also been the victims or the survivors of systemic violence, racism, the impacts of colonization, the legacy of slavery, and the like, including our current criminal justice system. We of course would want, as a trauma-informed practitioners, we would want to be attending to those systemic factors. That's an essential invitation and even obligation in the work of restorative justice. And I should say that it's not the main focus of the guide that we put together or the webinar that we're presenting today. We know that community safety can only really be achieved when there is an attendance to and a recognition of the trauma that many people who commit offenses bring to their experience and to their decisions. If we don't attend to offenders' trauma, it is likely that cycles of violence will be perpetuated in our communities. And so working with offenders is also essential to good restorative justice practice. And I think many of the strategies that you'll hear about in this webinar pertain or are applicable to working with offenders. That is not the focus of the guide, however, and it's not the focus of this webinar either. We'll be focusing solely on crime victims and how to work effectively and compassionately as we know how. Last note on language. The word victim is a problematic word. It speaks nothing of the kind of resilience and resourcefulness that many people impacted by crime live out. It is meant here to describe as a shorthand a person's situation within a given interaction of crime or injustice. It is not meant as an identity label, nor to refer to somebody's personality or capacity. And of course, and those of you who are practitioners on the line know that we in the field make a practice of referring to people by using the language that they offer to us as opposed to imposing language onto them. So there's that caveat. Okay, so we're going to move ahead now and talk about some of the methodology for this research, and I'll hand it over to you, Alan.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Yeah, we just wanted to sort of set the stage for what we have undertaken here. And so, as Aaron mentioned, in addition to him and me, our team comprised Jennifer Haslett, Matthew Hartman, and Catherine Bargan, and for a time Jennifer Cracknell as a research assistant. And the job that we took on was to identify and collect and analyze research related to work being done with victims in restorative justice, and then write and make available a resource guide for ARJA programs and practitioners here in Alberta, and if there was interest elsewhere. And so moving ahead to then our methodology, we conducted interviews with restorative justice practitioners, with victim serving agencies, and with other people connected to restorative justice. And then we moved ahead into a literature review. And in the lit review itself, we looked at existing academic research and what's called gray literature. For those of you who might not be familiar with the term gray literature, it's not about old people writing things. It's really about information being produced that's outside of the traditional publishing and distribution channels. And these things can include reports or working papers, newsletters, government documents, speeches, and white papers, those kinds of things. And so we collected that set of literature, and then researched it, wrote about it, and then went on to form the guide from there. And so with respect to the interviews, a member of our research team conducted a total of 20 interviews with victims and key representatives connected with ARJA or victim serving agencies. And moving ahead, I think to the results of that, I think, Aaron, if you want to move ahead to slide 5. We looked at these topics: what victims need out of a justice process, why they consider participating in ARJA, why they don't participate, safety and support, ARJA programs and partnerships, and then we wrap that up by looking at process and practitioner considerations. Just to go through these very briefly, with respect to victim needs, the number, not surprisingly for many of us perhaps, and then the number one need that victims have arising out of their experience of crime and harm and looking toward a justice response is the need for information. They want access. They want the ability to choose to receive information. As one victim told us, quote, "It is unanswered questions that continue to create pain," end of quote. A number two victim need is to have a voice. Victims want to have the ability to tell their stories and have a say in decision making and outcomes. Other important needs had to do with healing, with safety, with empowerment, to hear from others that what happened to them was wrong. And of course, financial compensation for damages and losses was also very important. Why victims consider participating, we looked at a number of the people we spoke with are in rural settings. And so people in those communities are likely to know each other, and they want to have a place where they can work things out more meaningfully and in a quicker time frame than they could if they went through the criminal justice system. Why victims do not participate, it had to do with some people said that the issues facing them were not important enough to devote more time to. For other people, it was they had concerns about their restorative justice practitioner programs in their area. Around safety and support, and there's much greater detail, of course, in the guide. I'd again recommend that to find out more about these things. I'm providing just a very, very brief summary. Victims are looking for safety and support. They want to speak with people who have access, who can help them connect with partnerships, connect with support groups, and they want people who are good listeners, which brings us to the practitioner considerations. They definitely want to have practitioners who are very professional in their conduct and are very attentive, sensitive to the content of what victims are dealing with, and who are knowledgeable about the dynamics of crime and victimization and the risks that victims perceive and the pain that crime victims experience is definitely noted as critical. So moving ahead to the literature review, one of the things that I wanted to frame for us here is the phrase, and this comes to us from our distant cousins in the transformative mediation community. Purpose drives practice, and for those of us who are practitioners in restorative justice, we need to be really clear about what our purpose is. What are we trying to accomplish in restorative justice? And for those of us in this field, we're privileged to have a rich literature that outlines what restorative justice is about, what our priorities are, what our values are. And so do think about that as Erin and I go through our time with you today. What is the purpose of our practice? What is the purpose of restorative justice? And so that was kind of a starting place for the literature review. In this review, we'll look briefly at defining restorative justice. We'll look at what arises out of two of those main definitions, this idea about being victim-centered. We'll look at victims' satisfaction and their dissatisfaction with their experiences in restorative justice. We'll look at their justice needs, and then we'll close the lit review section by looking briefly at some of the literature on best practices. And so when we look at defining restorative justice, I think for most of us here, we've heard two definitions more often than almost any others. One comes from Tony Marshall in 1999, where he calls restorative justice a process whereby the parties, just read him directly here, the parties with a stake in a specific offense collectively resolve how to deal with the aftermath of the offense and its implications for the future. Most of us have probably heard that quite a lot or read it quite often. And Marshall is aware that restorative justice is too rich a field, too rich an idea to be captured by a sentence or two. And so he talks about the priorities and the values and the objectives underneath that definition. And the number one thing that he identifies as the prime objective of restorative justice is, and again I'm quoting here, to attend fully to victim needs, material, financial, emotional, and social. And he goes on to talk about the other objectives of restorative justice. Over to the second definition from Howard Zare. He in 2015, he going back actually to 1990, he talks about, you know, what are the questions we ask ourselves as restorative justice practitioners, and the differentiating ourselves from other justice approaches. And he says the first question we ask ourselves in this restorative paradigm, if you want to call it that, is who has been hurt and what are their needs? And what flows from that starting place is that in the restorative vision of justice, justice should start with victim needs. And that's a theme that's continued throughout all of Zare's writings. In 2015, he updated his little book of restorative justice and became very, very clear and emphatic in saying that because victims have been hurt and justice starts with victim needs, we must start with victim needs. Very, very vital, important consideration for him. Moving ahead, away from the, or in addition to Zare's work, we want to invite you to look at some of the work around, and this is sourced in the guide as well, the work of Lode Walgrav, Ada Pecos-Melton from the United States, Mark Umbright and Marilyn Peterson-Armour from the United States as well. All of them have given considerable voice to and clarity of definition around what restorative justice is and how best to define it. And one of the themes that comes from all of these definitions and from many other people's as well is the importance that if justice starts with victim needs, that our processes in ARJA need to be victim-centered. And so if we go to the next slide, Aaron, we can take a look at, yeah, you can read that for yourselves. Moving on to the next slide though, this is a Zare quotation actually, yeah. That since victims have been harmed, restorative justice must start with those who've been victimized and their needs. Next slide. So when we look at what victim-centered means, few people have said it better than Umbright and Armour. It means that the harm done to the victim takes precedence and serves to organize the essence of the interaction around the key players. And although ARJA is victim-centered, the process is not victim-controlled. Very important that it's not victim-controlled. The facilitator still, we have obligations to address the needs of everybody who's in the room. Of course, we know that. And victim needs are the thing around which, are the things around which our work will be organized. And victims occupy a centrality, need to occupy a centrality in our work. And so how have we been doing with that? There's a great deal of well-documented restorative justice research that says we're actually doing very well. That victims are very satisfied with their experience in restorative justice and their needs are met, agreements are fulfilled, and so on. There's a lot of those, and we talk about that a lot in our restorative justice gatherings, our conferences, and so on. And there's another story that we need to be telling as well. And that story has to do with what happens, how often do victims go unsatisfied by their, or dissatisfied by their experience in restorative justice. And so when we look at that, processes, we find that there are some themes around victim dissatisfaction. They have to do with feeling their experiences, that they experience processes that seem to be primarily or maybe exclusively for the benefit of offenders, often young offenders, mostly young offenders. And many victims tell us that they feel like they're being used as tools for offender rehabilitation. So that, you know, they're brought in so that the offender can understand the consequences of their action better. And the victim needs themselves are not as fully addressed as offender needs. A lot of victims talk also in the research about feeling pressured to participate, to participate, to forgive, to come up with a settlement, to keep their tone positive, to be nice, whatever it is. Another area, this is a direct quote from one of the research documents, driven by ARJA process are driven by misunderstanding or careless application of ARJA principles by some practitioners and organizations. And particularly in cases of youth justice, restorative justice crime processes, victims feel very excluded from participation when ARJA is solely offered on the basis of the offender's birth date. So if an offender is 16, then a victim has an opportunity to participate. If an offender is 19 in a youth justice program, often they aren't. And so the program often determines the age of what constitutes youth, and that deals out a lot of victims. Next slide, Erin. So let's looking at victim needs. This is very strongly reflected also in the research around Alberta that we did around Albertans. Needs for acknowledgement, for validation, for vindication. Again, information, hugely important need, and the compensation as well. Active participation. They want to have a say if they're involved or not. If they're not involved, they might want to be involved through a surrogate, through a proxy, through the writing of a letter, things like that. They need protection, and there's some practical implications around if somebody damages their car, for example, they might need alternate transportation, that sort of thing. They want to have a chance to say how they were affected, and they want to hold the offender accountable. And many victims, not all by any means, want to hear an apology. For many victims, an apology isn't meaningful. For others, it's all important. Go ahead, Erin. This comes from James J.R. Guest in the United States, looking at links between Aboriginal justice, as he called it at the time, and restorative justice. That in Indigenous society, a debt is created that is owed to the victim when a crime occurs. And the offender lowers the victim's status by victimizing them, and it's that person's job, it's the offender's job to restore the victim's previous status that is specifically being equal with all others in society. And we wrap up the lit review by looking at what's out there for best practices. We often talk in restorative justice about, we're interested in best practices, and there's some really excellent research out there that looks at that. As touched on in a 2018 Department of Justice Canada report, just to draw out a couple of a point here. In terms of best practices, we are most successful when our work is trauma-informed and victim-focused. Go ahead, Erin. This is from a really extensive collection of research drawn together by Choi, Bazemar, and Gilbert in 2012. Best practices, practitioner training, thorough preparation of victims, offenders, and their supporters. Everybody should be very well prepared. A very victim-centered and victim-sensitive practice. Again, we're interested in best practices. They're saying best practice is victim-centered practice. A dialogue-driven process as opposed to coming up with quick deals, quick solutions, or being solution-focused. open, honest, respectful interactions where offenders feel safe enough to take responsibility rather than being guided by formulaic prescriptive processes. And a place where genuine feelings can be expressed. There are times when victims have said they weren't allowed to express their anger. Their anger was uncomfortable, too uncomfortable for somebody in the room, and so somebody didn't run around their feelings of anger so that they never got a chance to be expressed. Very important that a restorative justice process be a place where feelings have expression. And so, Aaron, anything coming up for you as we've gone quickly through the lit review?
I'm just playing back in my mind. I think the quote was "Purpose drives practice," and I think that I hope that we're all listening with that mindset, because of course, where we go from here is what does this mean for practice, both in terms of the individual practitioner, but also the programs that usually house the relationship between restorative justice as a field and individual crime victims and survivors. So thank you for laying that foundation, Alan, and we'll proceed.
Okay.
So the next section of the guide and the next section of the webinar is about what can leaders and administrators in the work of restorative justice do to take some of these needs and concerns seriously that Alan has been speaking about and that the literature will reference. So there's a number of different components, and of course, all of these are fleshed out further in the guide. The first is partnerships, and I would like to invite us to think about partnerships on two different levels, really. So any relationship that's a formalized relationship between a program and external partners is something we're calling a partnership. So that could be a funding relationship. It could be a referral relationship. It could be doing collaborative work together, and those types of relationships. So those are important, and we know from experience, of course, that the relationship between restorative justice programs and the victim assistance field, encompassing victim service and victim advocacy and both community and system-based victim support, is a vital relationship, and it's not always an easy one. There's lots of reasons for this. There's historical mistrust. There's sometimes a lack of real meaningful overlap in the types of cases that are being worked on. Yet it seems that as the element or the corner of the criminal justice system dealing with victims' needs and concerns, there's really a lot of opportunity and untapped potential in exploring those partnerships further. Now, that's one kind of partnership, is that the program partners with external agencies in order to do its work and get funded and the like. There's another dimension, I think, of partnership that is really important here too. And what if we took partnerships to heart as we were developing our programs or as we were reevaluating our programs? And by that, I mean specifically, if we had victims and survivors and their supporters at the table in making those kind of formative decisions about how programs will run, how they'll be constructed, where in the criminal justice system they're situated, how they're funded, and all of those other things. So really, this question, this idea of nothing about us without us is a refrain that we can remind ourselves, whether it's working with equity issues in restorative justice or working with victims and survivors. The same type of principles would apply. And I will say this, that if you're a person who's interested in really getting creative about program revisioning and redesign or creating new programs, there's a lot of specific advice in the guide about how we might do that in a way that has victim assistance at the helm with restorative justice specialists to make that kind of wholesale change or development in a collaborative way. I will say that a side benefit of this approach, this collaborative approach, maybe, and I think the potential of this is still somewhat untapped, but maybe to be a kind of a convening for really disparate and important voices within the criminal justice system to come together to better serve victims. So if we are talking about a collaborative way of understanding what we do in programs and how we steer the ship that includes multiple voices of stakeholders, including strongly the voices of victims and survivors, then wouldn't that be also a grounds to talk about where are the gaps in the system writ large and how can those be addressed? Monitoring and evaluation. This is an area that I would say in the restorative justice field, we have lots of work yet to do. There's some good work that has been done already. You can see why if we're setting on the task of deciding what we should be measuring, in other words, what constitutes success in restorative justice, how important it is to have the voices of victim survivors and their service providers at the table in that conversation. And so from that platform of shared goals and objectives regarding victims and their participation, we can then use data to grow and adapt. So different than the idea of, you know, is it working, what we're doing, is the idea of how can we learn from what we're seeing in the evaluation data to continuously grow and adapt in this very formative way. And to think outside the box about what measurements may be appropriate. We are talking here about a different paradigm than the traditional criminal justice system or criminal response. And so it would follow that the measurements used to define its success would also be different. And I would recommend the work of Jennifer Llewellyn and a team of her colleagues out of Dalhousie in talking about this through an article called Imagining Success for Restorative Approach to Justice. And that article is cited in the guide. Here are just a few examples of measurables that pertain specifically to victims and survivors. Victims' perception of fairness, levels of fear and or trauma symptoms before and after a restorative justice intervention. Some of that work has been studied, and it's still early days. Consistency between what the victim expects and what is experienced in the process. So these are just a few ideas of ways that we can start to measure success in terms of the goals and objectives that may be important to victims and survivors. Okay, referrals. This is of course a question that extends not only into how we as restorative justice agencies conduct our business, but also into how the system is structured as a whole. And the very notion of having to make referrals to restorative justice suggests quite a lot of differentiation and a kind of siloed reality between restorative justice and the rest of the society's response, and that may need to be questioned. However, what we can do is really start to think broadly about how and when referrals are received. Of course, many of you will know that most referrals come to restorative justice programs because first the person who committed an offense is referred, and then the next step is to find out whether the victim may want to participate or have some voice in some manner. That's the typical method. Now, is it possible, as some programs have started to do, that referrals can be made by, self-referrals can be made by victims and survivors directly to the program? Is it possible to develop mechanisms for victim assistance and victim services to make referrals? Certainly, this is happening. Certainly, a lot in the post-sentence arena with restorative justice in Canada. The Restorative Opportunities Program takes referrals from both victims and from within institutions. In the U.S., my understanding is that the serious and violent crime dialogue programs exclusively take victim-initiated referrals as opposed to taking any offender referrals. And so, yeah, thinking creatively about what that would look like, even on a diversion level. I know that in Oregon, for example, Clark County, well, I guess that's in Washington, but right over the water, Clark County and Clackamas County have both been working for some years now to accept victim referrals in juvenile justice cases, whether or not it's appropriate to take on a dialogue with the offender, because justice starts with the needs of the victim, and restorative justice is a representation of that at its best. Relatedly, we can think creatively about the types of programs that are offered. There's, I think, a tendency for us in the field of restorative justice to think about programs as well. We have this dialogue process, and the offender's referred, and if the victim wants to be a part of that, then they're welcome to be, and if they don't, then see you later. Well, there's other options too, and some programs, restorative justice programs, have built other types of processes. Restorative Justice Victoria, for example, which is one of the leaders in Canada on victim-centered practice, has been doing circles of support for victims and their supporters, independent of any work with offenders. There's a mentoring program in that agency for victims specifically at their request. Community justice initiatives in Langley, BC has a survivor support group that is conducted by some of the staff. So these are all ways that we can think in terms of parallel justice. This is not just about bringing people together in dialogue. It's about creating justice that meets the needs of victims independently from the offender's state of mind or readiness for dialogue. And restorative justice can be a part of that work. I was looking online earlier at the National Center for Victims of Crime based in the US, and I wanted to share with you their definition of parallel justice. Parallel justice elevates the goal of helping victims rebuild their lives to a fundamental component of justice. Parallel justice requires us to decouple the pursuit of justice for victims from the administration of justice for offenders. Under a system of parallel justice, the societal message to victims would be, what happened to you is wrong, and we will help you rebuild your life. Parallel justice requires society not only to hold offenders accountable for the harms they have caused, but also to honor a separate social obligation, that's for all of us, to repair the harm caused by crime. So, moving on to the question of training, coaching, and mentoring. Another big one, obviously, in the restorative justice field. Restorative justice has a credibility problem when it comes to the victim community, and part of this is because of training. I was just the other day sitting with two victim advocates from a sexual assault center, and they asked, what's going on with restorative justice training across Canada? And I had to be honest that the training environment here is so patchwork and so inconsistent that I couldn't offer them, a very straight response. And they were surprised by what I said. They recognized the seriousness of some of the cases that even community-based agencies are taking on, and felt concern. And that's not an uncommon response. And as a result, some of us in the restorative justice field have turned towards things like accreditation and standardized training on a regional or national level. This is also the subject of debate, of course, and one of the passages that always rings in my mind around this is John Braithwaite. Many of you know was one of the early scholars in restorative justice, writing in his article on restorative justice and standards, the specter of a Western accreditation agency telling an Aboriginal elder, for example, that a century-old restorative practice that does not comply with the accreditation standards is a profound worry. We should also worry about standards that are so prescriptive that they inhibit restorative justice innovation. So there's a paradox. On one hand, we need to elevate training and come up with some really good practices. On the other hand, making those practices prescribed and standardized risks a whole lot of cultural baggage and the possibility for even in some contexts further colonization of communities. So nevertheless, on that macro level, those issues exist. On a programmatic level, we can and arguably should develop robust and culturally appropriate training, and that this should involve regular follow-up training, not just an initial training. as well as ongoing mentoring, opportunities for newer practitioners to be brought into not just the skill set, but also the kind of mindset of the work. When we do training, we often have found it helpful to try to train core capacities, not just skills. You could be a really great, listener, or open questions come naturally to you, or paraphrasing is a skill you're good at, and yet, somehow for the victim and survivor, or for other participants, it could come across as inauthentic. There's a kind of a hidden set of capacities that restorative justice practitioners seem to need in order to do their work well, and training can try to build those and attend to those. And of course, in developing training, we can think again about partnerships. So it's not just people from within the restorative justice field, getting together and offering each other training. It's people from victim assistance, victims and survivors themselves, offering that critical insight into victimology and victims' experiences that restorative justice practitioners need to have. And I know for me personally that hearing those voices during training has been some of the most formative education that I've had in this field. Okay, moving along. Now, there's always going to be a question within programs about how to communicate publicly about restorative justice and what messaging to use. And often, and I don't know if this will come as good news or not, but often the messaging that we use actually highlights or reveals some of our own values when it comes to this work. And so it may be that if we're seeing our messaging not landing with victims and survivors well, it may be that we actually need to do some reflection about what it is that we believe about the work. I don't know if this metaphor will capture it, but it sometimes feels a bit like restorative justice is a buffet, and imagine that you're bringing a vegetarian to that buffet, and while you're walking them there, you're talking about all the wonderful chicken souvlaki and steak dinner that is going to be waiting for them there. It's a little bit like what we can observe in the restorative justice field when it comes to communicating with victims and survivors. So here's some ideas about some of the typical messaging that's more offender and system focused on the left side of your screen. Giving young people a second chance, avoiding punishment, helping the young person or the accused learn from mistakes, saving court time, saving cost, helping address the root causes of crime, reducing reoffending, and even transforming the criminal justice system. Now, let me be clear, these are all important goals, and there's nothing wrong with these objectives. Are they the objectives that victims and survivors are after? And in my experience talking to folks who have been victimized by crime, that's typically not their starting place. They're much more interested in the offender's responsibility for the crime itself. The community's concerned for their well-being, hearing some active vindication and validation of their experience, and then opportunities to meet unmet needs. And these are often needs that are not even a part of their experience within the criminal justice system. Receiving answers, being heard by empathetic and trustworthy listeners, holding the offender accountable, having a say in how the issue is addressed, perhaps gaining some kind of reparation, whether it's financial or symbolic or other. So these are some things to think about when it comes to the idea of communicating publicly. Okay, I want to give you some information about the practitioner section of the guide and plant some seeds before we turn it over to questions from the group. So looking at the practitioner is a big topic, obviously. As I alluded to earlier in talking about training, the mindset of the practitioners is one of the important elements that we find is good to talk about. Again, the purpose leads leads practice. Alan said it better. And so the first piece we'll talk about is this idea of responsiveness. Anybody on the line who's been the victim of a crime will know that one of the experiences that can come with that is really an experience of disempowerment, that somebody has taken by the act, taken away the person's control over their life. And then following that, if the crime, as it often does, leads to the experience of psychological trauma, it can be an experience of a loss of control, even over our own organism, over our own response, and that can feel crazy making. It can sometimes feel degrading. And then finally, the loss of control that comes with the criminal justice response itself, and being trying to navigate a very complex and very a system that is not oriented per se to the needs of victims. So responsiveness comes as a trauma-informed approach to justice. That this notion that the person we're dealing with, in order to move towards recovery, would need to have a voice and an element of control over the process and over the goals. And so practicing restorative justice in a highly prescriptive way, on the other hand, where we dictate all the terms of what to expect, how the process will go, is not, in our research, in line with a trauma-informed approach. So this quote here from Emma Jo Snyder, whose son was murdered by a family member who was mentally ill, puts this very succinctly in terms of her goals for justice and for recovery. She says, "I don't mind recovery, but don't tell me closure. That one will get you a black eye." And I think, for other survivors, closure may be a term that works for them. And this is something we have to be sensitive to, that not everybody approaches justice with the same needs. In fact, the needs are quite diverse. And we really want to approach the practice with that attitude of almost a state of not knowing as the first impulse, not knowing, and allowing the person who's sitting in front of us to create the mental map of what it is that they want out of this. So responsiveness and goals, and I think here it goes without saying that creating an expectation around forgiveness or reconciliation or shaking hands or any of those types of harmonious gestures would not also be in line with a responsive approach. Responsiveness also affects how we do practice. So how are decisions being made about where and when meetings happen, who's invited to participate, how the room is set up, who speaks first, how in what order are the participants to speak, what questions will be explored, etc. And the list could go on for some time if we sat together and brainstormed these lists. So this is something that many programs are doing currently, is providing a lot of options for victims and survivors to participate in ways that are meaningful to them and to help design and influence the process rather than just being told how it's going to go. So thinking on a spectrum of in terms of facilitated dialogue, obviously one of the components of restorative practice, from limited or no involvement to full involvement. There would be a whole range of places where victims and survivors may wish to put themselves on that, all the way from "I want nothing to do with this" to, for example, writing a letter and having it read out in a conference or in a circle, videotaped exchanges, having somebody come on their behalf, attending the conference for part of the time, not the whole time, not attending the conference, but deciding or requesting that a separate meeting be held with just them and the person responsible, that's aside from the circle, all the way to full participation of contributing to the entire dialogue. So just to give you a snapshot of all these multiple ways, again, Restorative Justice Victoria is doing a lot of great work around this. The Collaborative Justice Program in Ottawa also very responsive. You know, many cases they work with don't involve any kind of face-to-face meeting, and yet crime victims are being served through that program according to their needs. The crime survivor, Karis Craig, whose father was murdered a few decades ago, and who subsequently had the opportunity to speak with the man responsible, wrote after her experience that the control that the restorative justice facilitators gifted to me meant everything. When trauma and its subsequent mini traumas are struck upon you, control is the first thing that is ripped away. In the restorative justice process, control is the first thing that is given back. Next comes respect, and then comes a profound experience of dignity. So here's a big topic. You know, many people, especially those coming out of the conflict resolution world, have been taught to think about the role of the practitioner and as facilitator as neutral. And of course, behind this is the important insight that we shouldn't be working to elevate the needs or the well-being of one side at the detriment of another, that it's not a zero-sum game, and that we shouldn't be trying to use our processes to try to help somebody win. And that's obviously important in restorative justice too. Neutrality, however, is a response or is a metaphor that has sometimes proven to be unhelpful. It can signal a lack of investment, both in the process itself and in the outcomes of the process. And so we may need to find new metaphors for the sake of working well with victims and survivors. One of the things that we might ponder is the difference between injustice and conflict. Conflict obviously is a term that suggests mutual contribution to a problem, to a misunderstanding, or to disagreement. And morally speaking, conflict it suggests a kind of an even playing field, or sitting at a morally equal table. Injustice has a different connotation. Injustice suggests that there's a morally unequal plane, there's been a violation of a person's rights or dignity, or that there's been an act of domination which needs to be addressed as such. And the problem is that when we use terms and language that come out of the conflict resolution fields to talk about injustice, it can signal to the victim that they're responsible for, a share of their victimization, which then can further contribute to much of the self-blame, self-doubt, and shame that many victims feel, and can actually lead to their re-victimization. We need to be really cautious about importing terminology and neutral language from the conflict resolution field. Judith Herman, the U.S. trauma specialist, talks about the needs of victims. One of the great articles she wrote was called "Justice from the Victim's Perspective." She says that working with victimized people requires a committed moral stance. We must affirm a position of solidarity with the victim. And so, when, for example, Alan and I and others in our other colleagues have led trainings, we often ask questions to practitioners about what this would mean for them. What does moral solidarity mean in the work of restorative justice? What we know it doesn't mean is ceasing to tend to and to care about the needs of those who have offended, and nor does it mean that victims can do no wrong. Somehow, though, this stance of moral solidarity seems to be a part of the growing edge for restorative justice practitioners working with victims. This has an impact on how we use language. Clearly, there's ways of using language that acknowledge violence and injustice, and other ways that can serve to erase violence and injustice. And there have been research studies on facilitated dialogue work that has done that, where it's been found that there's a tendency on the part of the practitioner to use words like the evening in question, or the event, or the dispute, when really what we mean is the assault. And so making an effort to be more active in naming the crime can be a way of providing validation for victims. And of course, you know, this is not to be taken as the suggestion to embellish or to become non-objective in how we're talking about things, but simply to recognize through language what actually happened. So because of some of these concerns, the limitations of the word neutrality, you know, we may need to hunt for alternative metaphors that allow for greater flexibility on the part of the practitioner. And you know, and one of those metaphors that that may be helpful is the metaphor of the companion. The term companion, also accompaniment, comes from to break bread together. Suggesting a real and authentic relationship of trust. And that seems to be the kind of relationship that crime victims and survivors actually need from us, as do people who cause harm. We can work to cultivate not only our skills, but our presence as well. And presence is a concept that is sometimes hard to get our heads around, but by presence, we're speaking in the guide about steadiness, so emotional grounding, being able to deal with whatever's coming up for you as a practitioner without it having to then be projected onto the other. Unconditional positive regard, being able to see and honor the person in front of us, you know, and accept them where they are and how they are. And the idea of radical curiosity, which is a term that is meant to spark us to think of how do we move away from projecting our own mental maps of where a person should be onto them, and instead allow them to create the map of where they want to go and how. One thing that I have experienced, and personally as well as in conversations with other practitioners, is really the importance of our own wellness when it comes to cultivating presence. It's really hard to be present for others when we're struggling to the point of overwhelm ourselves. And so whatever we can do to maintain our wellness, obviously there's no perfect state there. All facilitators are going to be struggling at times, and that's probably an important element of working empathically with others. But when it comes to the point of overwhelm, we seem to cease to be of value to other people and cease to be able to accompany them as necessary. So I'm just going to share with you a few ideas about the skills of facilitators that we think may be important in working with crime victims and survivors, and then we'll get a chance for some questions and dialogue. Of course, the skill of the facilitator would apply through exploratory meetings and working with people individually. If there's some kind of a dialogue process, whether it's direct or indirect, you know, through face-to-face interactions or through letters or through, you know, indirect communication of other kinds, and through the work of follow-up, which is so vital and which is something that crime victims have said over and over again they need from us and from other people within the system. The skills like the skill of building a trusting relationship, following through on what we say we're going to do, having integrity, being honest, being real, being a human being, having humor, having meaningful boundaries, emotional boundaries. These are all elements of building trust with participants. There's really no way to fake these things. One thing that I recall reading was a study that was done of the pilot of the Restorative Opportunities Program, which was in the Pacific in BC, Community Justice Initiative's Victim Offender Mediation Program, and an independent evaluator was looking at how's it going and why is it working well. And he said that for both victims and offenders, it was vital that they were being not only listened to but heard. This attribute did not come across simply as a professional technique, but as one human being caring about one another, one human being caring about another. And so there's no way to you know, hide behind a mask on this work. One of the skills that often comes up in the work is validation. This is different than just pure acknowledgement. It's different than reflecting back to somebody what we think they said. It's also reflecting just how okay that is and how valid that is, and inserting an element of, we could say, solidarity with the person speaking. This includes being able to validate a person's physiological experience of anger or even the symptoms of trauma, and to point those out as really normal responses to an abnormal situation or to an unjust situation. Silence is a communication skill that doesn't get talked a lot about in normal communication training. We often focus on the words rather than the spaces between them. Silence, though, as you've probably experienced, can indicate deep listening, a desire to know more, affirmation that the speaker's truth is what's really important here, that the speaker is under no time pressure, or that the speaker's story simply defies summary, and that we as the listener are bearing witness to a testimony that really there is no words to reflect back. And lastly, the skill of assertion. Obviously, assertive communication is a larger field and extends beyond the boundaries of restorative justice. But one thing we do know from working with victims is that if they sense in us a feeling that they will receive our support if needed, that we will create firm boundaries if there's, for example, victim blaming happening in a facilitated dialogue, or that their accounts are being cut off prematurely, or that somehow power imbalances are negatively affecting the victim or survivor. Having those assurances and sensing that in the practitioner can be a source of some comfort and reassurance to victims. I'll just wrap up this section by going out on a bit of a limb here and saying that some of my mentors and teachers in this field have taught me that in some ways what all these skills come down to is the ability to express love to the people that we're working with, and what specifically that means is, and I'm going to use Mary Clark's definition here from a book she wrote called In Search of Human Nature. Love as the security produced by experiencing nurturing acceptance and guidance towards autonomous development. So this idea of both nurturing, accepting a person where they're at, and also holding space for them to work towards their own autonomous development and walking alongside of them in that process, I think is one way or one metaphor that might be interesting to think about as we pursue this work further. So I will wrap it up there, and I guess I should ask you, Alan, is there anything you wanted to add on to before we open it up for questions?
I guess I'm just reflecting on your last quotation there, and yeah, what a challenging sort of goal that is for any of us to address yourselves to, number one, and number two, I can't think of ever having heard anything like that in training, right? In community programs, and so yeah, what a noble goal, and again, if we are serious about the idea of purpose driving practice, what is our purpose behind that, and how do we, if our purpose is to show unconditional positive regard or love or something, that will influence our practice for sure.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Food for thought, and I hope that you all on the line feel comfortable in asking questions, and Jen, feel free to help us along with this, so that I think you may be the one receiving the questions.
Yeah, actually, Jen has forwarded some questions to me.
Great.
Some really challenging ones. One of them that I wanted to bring forward, just to see what some of her thoughts might be, Aaron, has to do with I'm just trying to find the question here. having to do with domestic violence, actually, and what how does restorative justice look when we're trying to address harm done in domestic violence situations?
So we'll
Obviously,
start with the simple ones, right?
sorry, what?
We'll start with the simple ones then, right?
Oh, yeah, we'll ease our way in here for sure. So obviously, a question that requires a very long and detailed and thoughtful and very careful answer, and something that we can not really sort of tackle and do justice to in this webinar. But just to say something totally briefly, you know, there's some really interesting literature out there on some very imaginative approaches to working with domestic violence in RJ. Having separate circles where victim and offender never come together in the same room, and having proxies go back and forth from between circles, and the circles are not like one-off events as sometimes we think of them in a lot of our restorative justice practice, but circles that would meet monthly, for example, over a period of years. And you know, I would absolutely want to shine a light, a very positive light on the groundbreaking work that Todd Augustus Scott and his Bridges program out in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Truro, Nova Scotia are doing. That's some of that work. A piece of that work is featured in the film A Better Man, a documentary that came out a couple of years ago. Highly recommend people take a look at that. Todd's approach to restorative justice is what you might call a very therapeutic one, and yeah, definitely worth a look. Obviously, an extraordinarily patient level of care and attention and time needs to go into, and patience needs to go into working in that area, in addition to which practitioners, I think everybody would agree, need a lot of training in domestic violence and how to approach it, how to support victims of domestic violence, how to support and encourage accountability for those who use violence in intimate relationships. Aaron, some thoughts?
Yeah, just to tag on to that, again, the importance of partnerships. I mean, as we approach this topic, you know, the importance of being in constant conversation with people from the anti-violence sector and who work every day with issues of violence against women, to be able to have these conversations, or to co-facilitate, or to collaborate in some way as we even begin to explore the topic is an important piece.
Nice, thank you. A question that I think might be geared more to the things that you were talking about, Aaron. What's the difference between capacities and skills? How would a person differentiate between those?
Yeah, great question. I would say that a capacity is something bigger than a skill. So that a capacity would require us to be grounded in a certain kind of mindset. It requires that we have done maybe some personal work. So just to give an example, you know, listening. You know, there's lots of listening techniques that have been put out there, and you know, I remember seeing a film one time when there's these two lawyers talking, and one lawyer says, is you know, the listener, and really doing a lot of paraphrasing, and the speaker stops at one point and says, "Would you cut out that active listening crap with me?" And the speaker says, "You know, I can listen and actively listen at the same time, you know." And so this just suggests that, you know, beyond the skills, there's some of these attributes of really wanting to know. For example, curiosity, openness, wondering about a person, and you'll find, if you've been through any kind of communication skills training and you're having to do drills and exercises, the difference between doing that from a state of curiosity versus just doing it as a routine exercise and trying to get the wording right. The skill goes much easier, first of all, when it's done from that intent or from that platform of the capacity, and it also lands better and it feels more natural. So that's just an example of what we mean by that.
Nice. Another question, maybe both of us could take a swing at this, but I'll start with you. Um, this person is asking about the ordering of questions, and thinking that in dialogues, the ordering of questions would include restorative questions, as have been distinguished elsewhere, and wondering whether they are similarly included in the guide.
I think that what's provided in the guide would certainly have some overlap for those that have encountered the idea of restorative questions. I think the intent of those restorative questions, if what you're referring to is some of the work that was put forward by Real Justice or the International Institute for Restorative Practices, there's the intent behind those questions, I think, is largely in line with what is being promoted here. I think a difference is that because of the value that's being placed on responsiveness in this approach, the ordering of questions is something that we feel is really case specific and up to where we see the greatest need to go. It may be, for example, that in answering, if we're speaking in the context of a facilitated dialogue, for example, that it may be that in having done our preparation work well, we realize that the survivor wants to be asked different questions than the questions that are on that script, and then we would attend to that, knowing that those needs are front and center. And so those questions, at least in my own experience, serve well as a kind of a back pocket. These are some useful things to think about, as opposed to any kind of a script. And I know that different practitioners work differently. There's probably there's many people for whom restorative justice is synonymous with the scripted approach, and it certainly needs to be said that from the perspective of the authors of this guide is not the case, that those two things are synonymous, but that all corners of the field have something important to offer on the questions that we're grappling with here. Do you want to add anything, Alan?
I think so. Yeah. I think if we want to really position victims as central to our work in restorative justice, I think in addition to the things that you have spoken wonderfully about today, Aaron, with respect to programs and practitioners, I think we need to take a look at our processes actually as well. How can we maximize victim involvement in our processes, and answering that question honestly might require that we change our processes, and I think we need to be open to that. I think we need to be very careful about that, but not shut the door. And I think the scripted conferencing thing is only one way of doing conferencing. There's a lot of others that are geared to be much more responsive to victim needs and to emerging issues and dynamics in a conferencing process. I think all of us need to be prepared to look at our processes and try to make new choices, brave choices in the direction of being more responsive to victims and their needs.
Yeah, I was just thinking of a case actually, Alan, when you were talking, and it was one of the first cases that I worked to help facilitate in the post-sentence program in BC. So in a case that involved a woman who had lost her son in a drunk driving crash, and who had the need to meet with the man who was responsible, and we got into the room, and I remember I was kind of ready to do some kind of opening spiel, or set the tone and start out on my, still not scripted, but the model, right? And as we got into the room, this mother just immediately launched into conversation with the prisoner, and it actually wasn't, and it was a helpful conversation. It wasn't one that I felt any need to interrupt on behalf of anybody. And it was probably half an hour into that dialogue that I said my first words, and they had nothing to do with what I thought I was going to say, but instead it was a prompt of some kind, a question that was written down nowhere, but that seemed like it was an important question to address into the space. So just as an example of, let's follow the lead of our participants, but be grounded still in the values.
Yeah, really good. We have some great questions here, and unfortunately way more questions than you and I have time to take on here. But I think this will take us up to the end here. How can a survivor evaluate whether an RJ program is truly consistent with RJ principles? Maybe I'll just dive in here just to kick us off. You know, I think that victims and victim-serving agencies and pretty much anybody else who might ever use a restorative justice program have the right to interview, if necessary, interrogate a restorative justice program. We are accountable to the public. We're accountable to the people who work in it, who are participants in our programs. And we should have answers to questions like, how do you involve victims in your processes? How do you factor in victim needs and victim voice and choice into your processes? These are you know, people should feel free to interview those who run and work in RJ programs. Aaron?
All I would add is the need for, you know, for regular and rigorous evaluation that's being done at a programmatic level, and so if we're serious about evaluating the effects of our programs on meeting victims' needs, then you know, we should be able to provide that information for victims and survivors who are interested. Another thing just to add, this is way less formal, but I think something that can be really helpful is you know, in my programmatic experience, I've encountered many victims and survivors who have wanted to hear from or hear testimonials from other people in similar circumstances who have gone through their process. And so the ability to make an introduction or to provide some literature that was written by people who have been through it, or somehow make a connection with the experience that other victims have had, might be a helpful piece of the puzzle as well.
Great, good answer, good answer. Jen, back to you.
Wonderful. I would like to just thank everyone for joining us here today. We had over 200 people from around Canada, from the United States, and international. So really exciting that we can come together and glean such amazing information from both Alan and Aaron. So I would like to extend a huge thank you on behalf of the Alberta Restorative Justice Association for joining us today, Alan and Aaron, and sharing your thoughts and your wisdom and your knowledge with all of us. We did have an incredible amount of questions come flooding in at the end. So I will go through it, and maybe we can put together some kind of sheet that we can send out afterwards with some basic answers, guys, to those questions. But if you haven't already checked out the guide online, please do so at www.arja.ca under our resources tab. And please do take the time. It's literally only 5 minutes to fill out the survey, so we can continue to hopefully offer awesome webinars and informational experiences like this. So with that being said, I think we'll sign off. All right.
Thank you so much. And I'll just add that, yes, our email addresses are on this final page here. If folks want to reach out, we'll do our best to respond. It sounds like there's a lot of questions, and so be patient with us. And thank you, Jen, as well, for all the work that you've done to make this happen. It's been a real privilege.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jen, and thanks everybody for your interest in this topic. Please check out the guide. It costs nothing but a couple of minutes to download it. And yeah, thanks again for your interest. Take care, everybody, and all the best looking at the role that victims occupy in restorative justice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys.
Bye.